Hello, everyone. This will be the second of two lectures on C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. Now, in my first lecture, I talked about the Tao. That's the word that Lewis uses to designate the universal moral ethical code that crosses all time and all cultures, that finally comes from God and is implanted in our conscience. And in the first lecture, we looked at what happens when you throw the Tao out of an education system. So the focus was really on education and on children and what you're doing. What I want to do now is move towards the second half of the abolition of man and expand the scope, because Lewis not only shows us what happens to an education system that becomes values-free, if you will, what also happens to an entire nation, to the world, to people on the sort of larger political scale. What happens to the adults, if you will, when the Tao is thrown out? Now, I want you to think for a moment about the Tao as a sort of circle that inscribes us. Again, the universal moral ethical code inscribed in our conscience, that Tao, which is objective morality, that sort of holds us, each individual and each nation ultimately, within a circle. We're circumscribed within that circle. Now, of course, that circle puts limits and boundaries on us. And a lot of people, especially modern people, are eager to step out of that circle. Why should we subject ourselves to the Tao? Why don't we just step out and be free and just follow our desires, our dreams, our lusts, and follow everything? Well, part of the problem is that even though that Tao-shaped circle does put limits and boundaries on us, it stops us from being a radically autonomous individual who does whatever he wants. But when you step out of that circle, you get freedom, but in a very real sense, you cease to be a human being. And so what we're going to talk about now is what happens not just in education system, but when a nation, when people as a whole step outside of that Tao-shaped circle and what it leads to. Now, my talk is kind of broken into two halves here because there's two ways of stepping out of the Tao-shaped circle. One way, the simpler way that's been going on for a longer period of time, is what you do is you take one part of the Tao and you make it into the entire Tao. Now, this is a problem because the Tao, the Universal Moral Ethical Law Code, is a package deal. When God revealed the 10 Commandments to Moses, they were not the 2 commandments and the 8 suggestions. They were the 10 commandments, right? You can't take one commandment and use it to break all the rest. But that's what's been happening increasingly in the modern world, really starting in the Enlightenment and moving more and more and more, that we start thinking, oh, this part of the Tao is the most important part, and now I'll make that the center. Lewis wrote a book later than Abolition of Man called The Four Loves. He talks about the 4 Greek words for love: eros, which is physical, erotic love; philia, which is friendship; storge, which means affection; and of course, caritas or agape, God's self-giving love. And Lewis says that eros, friendship, and affection, they're all good. But whenever we try to take one of them, eros or friendship love or affection love, and we turn it into a god, then Lewis says it always becomes a demon and comes back and bites us, okay? Only agape love is God's self-giving love. The human loves are good, but when we make those loves end in themselves, make them into little gods, they will become demons that attack us. And the trouble is, sometimes the more good that demon is, the more it fools us, right? If we can find one part of the Tao that's really good, we might be more willing to break everything else to get to it. Now, Lewis is writing in the 40s here, and it's a time when totalitarianism from the right and left, although both of them are atheistic, both are throwing out objective morality, both are liberal in that sense. Both the Nazis and the communists were both using this method of taking one part of the Tao and turning it into everything. For the Nazis, they thought that ethnic purity and ethnic pride was so important that you could break and destroy everything else to achieve it. The communists, on the other hand, thought that equality was so important that, again, you can kill and maim and destroy as many people as you want to achieve it. Now, both of those are equal evils. But I think, especially today, that the second one is most evil. Because if, the Ku Klux Klan or white supremacists step up and start talking about ethnic purity and all, I think most people will see through it. But unfortunately, we don't see through equality. Many Americans say, oh, equality, that's a good thing. Do whatever it takes. Unfortunately, what it takes is murdering and then brutally re-educating hundreds of thousands of people. We've got to be careful. This rise in an interest of socialism amongst young people partly is brought about by this idea that equality is the most important thing. Well, equality is good, but it's not the center of virtue, and it's certainly not the whole of the Tao. So we need to be careful. It is a package deal. We don't want to end like the Mafia and the Godfather or maybe the Sopranos, where this idea of family honor is so important. And that's a noble thing, family honor. But in the name of family honor, these people will break every other rule, kill and steal and maim and betray everyone. And it's actually self-defeating, because if you've ever seen The Godfather 2, Michael Corleone, everything's about family honor until the end of the movie when he kills his own brother, Fredo. Sorry for the spoiler if you haven't seen that. But that's what happens, right? In modern America now, even more dangerous than equality is this idea that tolerance or inclusivism is such an absolute good that we can break every other moral, ethical rule in order to achieve it. We need to be careful. When we do that, we're stepping out of that circle that protects us and makes us human. Lewis wrote, you all know about the Chronicles of Narnia, but before the Chronicles of Narnia, he wrote a trilogy of science fiction novels. And the first one is called Out of the Silent Planet, and he invents a memorable character there called Weston. And Weston's a bad guy, but he's not a simple thug. He is an idealist who believes that the most important thing is species survival, by which he means the human species. And he thinks that's so important, and he's so noble about it, that he's willing to go to places like Mars and colonize them and even wipe out the rational beings who populate Mars. Anything to achieve that end. Later on, when he got to the Chronicles of Narnia, he wrote one called The Magician's Nephew, and the magician is named Uncle Andrew. And he believes that he must find the secrets of other worlds. And it's so important for him to carry on his search for knowledge that he's willing, again, to break every moral rule. First, he experiments on guinea pigs, and then when the book begins, he actually experiments on children and feels no guilt whatsoever that he's manipulating children because he thinks his end of knowledge, ours is a lonely destiny, he thinks it actually justifies it. And there's an irony there, though, because he expects Diggory to live up to courage. That's part of the Tao. He's not going to follow the Tao, but he expects everybody else to follow the Tao. Now, both Weston and Uncle Andrew, and also Queen Jadis, if you've read The Magician's Nephew, are all examples of what Nietzsche called the Superman, or Ubermensch, or Overman. This is someone who feels like he has the right and privilege to rise above middle-class morality. And middle-class morality is basically the Tao. But they don't have to follow those strictures anymore. They've got a vision that is greater and will make a greater world, and so it's okay for them, but of course nobody else, to break all other aspects of the Tao. So that's the first way we step out of the circle. We take one part of the Tao and make it into all of the Tao, and that's reflected kind of suddenly in the Abolition of Man. But the second one is a little more central to what Lewis is talking about. And that is when we throw the Tao out altogether and start making up new moralities. We're going to make up a new sort of man-made Tao. And that's when it gets even more insidious and even more dangerous. Now, to understand how that works, first let's bring back the Ubermensch again, the Nietzschean Superman, because the Nietzschean Superman ultimately believes that there is no such thing as objective morality. There is just power, right? The winners write the history books. The winners determine what is right and wrong. Or as Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic said thousands of years ago, might makes right. Justice is the will of the stronger. And the Nietzschean Superman has the will to power to rise above, as Nietzsche says, beyond good and evil. Because for the Superman, there are no set standards of goodness and evil. He sets the standard himself. So that's one quality, one factor. The other factor is something we actually talked about in class when we did Mere Christianity and first talked about the Tao. And I said there that a traditional conservative person believes that the problem with man is sin and disobedience. But Rousseau starts the more liberal progressive idea that the problem with man is ignorance and poverty. And that sounds so wonderful. But the trouble is, once you convince yourself that man is by nature good, that he doesn't have an inner depravity, but that man is by nature good, but is corrupted by society, but you believe that you can educate people to be good. Unfortunately, that ends up becoming, in a totalitarian state, brutal re-education. Think of the re-education camps in the Soviet Union or Maoist China, or if you know anything about Cambodia and what they call the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, or Castro for that matter, down in Cuba. There is this sense that we can perfect man. And what happens is first you kill off all the people that are too corrupt, for whatever reason they're too corrupt, and then you start educating everyone. Now, what happens is, again, you throw out the Tao, and you start creating new moralities, and you start to try to create a new kind of man. You think you're going to perfect this pure Soviet worker, or this pure Chinese communist under Mao. You just got to kill off all the capitalists and all that stuff, and then we'll re-educate everybody. Now, it's kind of subtle, because generally speaking, people don't start by immediately trying to change man and reprogram him. They start by trying to change nature, by forcing nature to serve us. Now, what that means, to use the language of my first lecture, objective versus subjective, to do that, you have to take nature and turn it into a pure object, a thing, a cog that can be manipulated, that you can change it in any way you want to bring about this new world, right? Well, that's what it starts with, but it doesn't end there. Because sooner or later, after objectifying nature, we end up objectifying man, turning him into a cog in the machine, into just some part of the state, of the Marxist state, or whatever it happens to be. And we're no longer a subjective individual. We're a thing that can be manipulated and changed, right? Now, to really understand the abolition of man and the brilliance of C.S. Lewis is that two things are happening in the modern world that are flip-flopping. Traditionally, not only man, but nature was treated in a subjective way. It's linked to us inside. It's not just a dead thing, right? It's somehow linked to us, our perceptions affected and whatnot. But what happened is that we took what should have been subjective, especially man, and made it objective. But at the same time, and this is the first lecture I gave, we took the good, the true, and the beautiful, all of which should be objective, morality, beauty, and just truth, philosophical and theological truth, moral and ethical standards, and aesthetic standards of beauty. We took those and we subjectified them. We said they're all in the eye of the beholder. And of course, as we said in the first lecture, that means they're no longer important. We can do whatever we want. So there is this insidious flip-flopping. And when you subjectify the good, the true, and the beautiful and do it away, and then you objectify man and turn him into a machine, now, Lewis says at the very end of his book, is when we start thinking we can see through everything. Our eyes have been cleansed. No more illusions about bourgeois morality and goodness and truth. We now see through everything. But this is the famous closing lines of the book. Lewis says, "You cannot go on explaining away forever. You will find that you have explained explanation itself away. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent because the garden on the other side of it is opaque. You don't see through it, right? How if you saw through the garden too? This is what's happened with sort of modern philosophy is we lose our... It's kind of weird. They not only have thrown out the fall, the idea that we're depraved, they've also thrown out the idea that we were made in God's image. And when both of those things go, then anything's possible. When we've lost what often philosophers call Christian realism, that we're good, made in God's image, have intrinsic worth and value, but we're fallen and sinful and disobedient, both of those things get thrown out, and then we start to manipulate and change and have power over. Now, the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, the late Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, they all want to believe that religion is evil and controlling, that it puts strictures on people and crushes their human nature. Well, there have been some bad religious people, right? But that is not what true Christianity does. True Christianity frees us to be the people we were created to be. The people that really try to control and have power and turn other human beings into cogs in the machine, as well as nature, that's not the religious people in terms of Christians. Those are the magicians, okay? And there's a big difference between magic and religion. Or maybe a good way to describe this, there's a difference between prayer and voodoo. Christian prayer means, "Oh Lord, if it is your will you do this? Help me to be conformed to your will and to understand what you would have me be." That's not voodoo. Voodoo means if I know the right spell, if I know the right words, if I know the right incantation, I can actually force God or the gods or the spirits or the ancestors to do what I want them to do. Magic is about power. And as Lewis explains, there was very little magic in the Middle Ages. That really comes into the Renaissance and as we're moving into the Enlightenment. Magic and alchemy and all that. And Lewis says, interesting, the real twin to the magician, the real twin to magic is not religion. The twin of the magician is the scientist. And he makes a link between Bacon and Faust. Now, who are these two people? We need to understand this, to understand the last section of it. Bacon is Francis Bacon, and Francis Bacon is actually a Renaissance figure, but he kind of kicks things off. He actually worked at the court of Queen Elizabeth I in England, so he's a Renaissance man, quite literally, Elizabethan. And he was a Christian and did some good things, but he was the one that started to make science more instrumental, using science to control. He's the one who said knowledge is power. Rather than knowledge being a form of Platonic or Aristotelian or Aquinian or Dantean contemplation, a kind of thing that draws us closer to God, now knowledge becomes a tool for controlling. Knowledge is power. Now, Faust is not a real person, but Faust is the story of the magician who sells his soul to the devil for hidden wisdom and power. And again, both the scientist and the magician want power, and they are looking for ways to manipulate nature, but sometimes also manipulate mankind. They go together. And here, I didn't have room for it in my outline, but here's a quote from Abolition of Man, the third part. Lewis says, "For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue." Right? This is the world, and how do we adapt ourselves to the world? And we learn discipline and virtue, and that was not only understood by Jews and Christians, but by the higher pagans in Greece and Rome, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, the higher ones. But for magic and applied science, for Faust and Bacon, for whom knowledge is power, for them, the solution, for magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the whims of men. Not how do we adapt ourselves, but how do we make nature and then man serve us. And the solution is not self-discipline and virtue. The solution is a technique. And both magic and applied science, in the practice of this technique, are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious, such as digging up and mutilating the dead. Then he goes on to say, the serious magical endeavor, that would even include something like alchemy, which is in between, and the serious scientific endeavor are twins. One was sickly and died, that's magic. The other strong and throve, but they were twins. They were born of the same impulse. And that impulse is to use knowledge to control first nature and then man, to remake the world in our image. Now, one more time, we got to go back to the Nietzschean Superman, because there is a branch of the Nietzschean Superman that we call the mad scientist. The most famous mad scientists in literature are Dr. Frankenstein from the novel by Mary Shelley, Dr. Jekyll from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, and Captain Nemo from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. What do all three of them have in common? Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll, and Captain Nemo. All of them want to be friends of man, right? Frankenstein wants to find a way to defeat our greatest enemy, death. Dr. Jekyll wants to literally remove the evil part of our soul so that we can become an angel. And Captain Nemo wants to use his Nautilus to bring world peace by destroying naval vessels that are military naval vessels. Unfortunately, in doing that, all of them throw out the Tao and think that what they're seeking, this forbidden knowledge, is so important it will allow them to dig up the dead or to experiment on himself and end up bringing a demon out of him, Mr. Hyde, or killing innocent sailors to get world peace. So this is what happens. But when we throw out the Tao and when we throw morality out of education, when we kill the true virtue that's inside, what happens? Well, again, once we have that desire to control and once we've seized control of nature, and by the way, the totalitarian companies, especially the communist ones, destroyed nature. The Chinese and the Soviets destroyed nature, and they're still trying to get it back. This idea that they're, quote, liberal and therefore care about nature, they're not stewards. They're trying to use it, and they're still trying to get their economy back. Because, again, this idea of control. Now, here's the problem. That desire to control makes us want to build utopia and makes us, again, think that we can remold man and make him better. But here's the problem. If a generation takes it upon themselves to reprogram and change man, maybe genetically or whatever, to re-educate and rechange us, well, that generation has free will. But they've robbed every other generation after them of free will because they've turned them into something else, right? Only the first generation, Lewis calls them the conditioners. They get to choose, but nobody else gets to choose. But here's the rub. Here's the scary part. Okay, these conditioners themselves, think of 1984, Brave New World, if you've read those dystopia novels, those people are changing everything, but what are they using as their standard or measure of what to do? Well, they're not using the Tao anymore because they've stepped outside of the Tao and are remaking morality. But what is their measure? What is their touchstone? Here's the terrible, terrible irony. Once I step outside of the Tao and change everything, then I've got nothing to guide me or to stop me from doing terrible things. And what Lewis says is, eventually, those conditioners will be controlled by two things, heredity and the weather, right? Depending on their genetic makeup, depending on whether they have indigestion or not, depending on whether it's a nice day or a bad day, they can decide, let's wipe out 1,000 people or forgive them. There's no longer any standard. And think about this. If you're being controlled by your genes, by nature, by the weather, you're actually being controlled by nature. And here is the meaning of the title of the book. We thought that we were conquering nature and making her into our tool. But by throwing out the Tao and morality, we have now literally become prisoners of nature, because we are now only controlled by our lusts, by our base material lusts. As Lewis explains it, all along we thought nature was putting up her hands in surrender, when actually she was reaching out her hands to embrace us forever. So in trying to perfect man, we have actually abolished man. Wow, that is the great irony at the end of the book. Now, to help us understand this, let's go back to Plato, because this book is very influenced by Plato, the idea of the head rules the belly through the chest. Head. That's something I talked about in the first video. But here, Plato kind of proves, well, first of all, the Republic exists to try to disprove the Nietzschean idea that might makes right, that there is a real thing such as justice. But what Plato shows is that the tyrant is the most enslaved person of all. Because if you're an absolute tyrant, you don't follow the law, you don't follow wise tutors, you don't follow virtue, you don't follow morality, you don't follow preachers, you have nothing to follow. And so what happens is you end up following your base lusts and desires. But guess what? What happens to you when you follow your base lusts and desire? Those are things that almost always destroy you. Whether or not there's a God, whether or not there's a heaven, when we allow ourselves to be driven by our appetites and lusts, sooner or later we'll be destroyed. And if you're one of these absolute tyrants, then the only thing you listen to are your lusts and appetites, but your lusts and appetites destroy you, and so you are now a slave to the worst slave master of all. Both Nero and Caligula started as very liberal and generous, gave out all their money, and then the money ran out. And then the devil within came out. Wow. Let me end with one last thing. This quote is also on your outline. Now, this has not really happened to us yet, right? I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the hippies in the 60s and 70s, a lot of those hippies eventually got married and became rather traditional, had families. Many of them became religious. I don't know, any of you listening have ex-hippie parents who now are pretty traditional, okay? The hippies of the old days are the homeschooling parents of today, right? Because what happens is that even though the hippies tried and experimented stepping outside the circle, they were all trained in the Tao. And the Bible says, train up a child in the way that he is to go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. Most of those people, because morality was instilled in them, they eventually came back to it. But what happens if you raise your children without the Tao, and they raise their children, sooner or later, we've lost. We're living, many people say, on moral capital. But that moral capital is running out, right? Sooner or later, we could destroy ourselves if we no longer have a way to prevent ourselves from self-destruction. Now, Lewis has this wonderful line. It's one of the best lines in Abolition of Man. He says, I would sooner play cards against a man who was quite skeptical about virtue, but had been brought up to believe a gentleman doesn't cheat. I would rather play cards against him than an irreproachable moral philosopher who had been brought up amongst sharpers. Right? The idea being, if that person had the Tao instilled in him, it will come back. But if you've been raised without it, or you've been raised to think that tolerance or inclusivism or egalitarianism is an absolute good and you can break everything else, that the only thing that matters are sins against equality and sins against morality are nothing. If we keep doing this and programming people, we are setting ourselves up for a world in which they will try to build utopia and end up building dystopia instead.